All right, folks, I want to welcome our guest to the show. It is Dr. Russ Jones. Welcome to the show, Doc.
Hey, thanks a lot. I appreciate you having me. I'm a big fan.
I appreciate it, man. I know we tried to do this, last year. I don't even know how it
Yeah,
didn't happen, but it doesn't matter. You're here now. That's all that matters. So
that's
I
right.
want
Here
to
we
get,
are.
I want to get right into it. I want to talk about this Bigfoot thing. And the question that always comes up for me when I meet somebody new and talk to somebody for the first time is, it's a basic question, but what got you interested in Bigfoot in the beginning? So why don't you just sort of give us a little bit of the background for the audience who may not know who you are, and then tell us what got you interested in the subject of Bigfoot. Bigfoot.
Okay. Well, the first time I had a Bigfoot encounter, I didn't know there was such a thing as Bigfoot. I grew up in Southeast Ohio, spent all my time hunting in Vinton County, Ohio, which still only has one stoplight to this day. It's mostly state and national forest land. And I was lucky enough to grow up in a family that was renowned for their outdoorsmen. My grandfather was the greatest outdoorsman I ever met. I was trapping from the time I was, just 7 or 8 years old. They already had me out. I'd killed my first rabbit when I was 6 with a little Crossman pump BB gun. And we had rabbit dogs and coonhounds, and people would drive from all over just to see how many bucks we had hanging on the first day of deer season. And so I always spent a lot of time in the woods. But in the 70s, New Year's Day, New Year's Eve, we got about 4 inches of snow. New Year's Day was really beautiful and sunny. And I had went out with a guy that was going to go to the service. We were running rabbit dogs. And I came along a hillside, and there was a cave on the hillside that was, maybe 100 yards, but you really just couldn't tell it was up there unless you knew. And I found a fresh trackway of, to me, not knowing anything about Bigfoot, it looked like human footprints. And this is the 70s. So I just thought that, as a drug person, some vagrant had found their way out in this remote area and was living in this cave. And so I went up there and looked in that cave because I was looking, for a fire or for some clothes or something. But it was apparent that whatever was staying in that cave would probably had weathered that storm there and had left because it heard me coming with the dogs. And the footprints weren't large. They were about a adult male size, but to me, they looked, I could see the toes, I could see everything. They were fresh. It just happened. And in the end, we just decided that we didn't know what it was. It was just some mystery, and we just kept hunting and moved on. Later that year, about a couple miles, maybe 3 miles cross country, there was this remote beaver dam that there wasn't a path or a trail to it, but my family had found it when we'd been hunting. And I was back there with an uncle, and we were fishing on this beaver dam. And I mean, a mile up the stream, it's so small that you could jump across it in the summer. But when you get up in the hollow, there was, 3 or 4 acres of a big pond that had a lot of good fishing in it. And my family would go up there. I had ran turtle lines. If anybody doesn't know what that is, you'd have these great big hooks, and you take a chicken gizzard raw and you throw it out into the water, and the snapping turtles will swallow it. And then you can, if you get to them soon enough, you can catch them. If not, they just kind of digest it and get off your hook. But I had been up there dozens and dozens of times hunting and fishing, and I had never had any type of thing happen to me ever. It was a very remote place, but my uncle and I were both wearing pistols. It was a very snaky place, and you were always seeing snakes in there. And the place where I was standing on the dam, I was maybe 40 yards, 35 yards from the other bank. And it was very brushy. I was just looking at a picture of it the other day. And we weren't talking. He was maybe, I don't know, 20, 25 feet on down the bank from me, maybe a little bit more. And I heard something walking on that bank over there. And I glanced over and I saw he was looking too. And I just assumed it was a deer or something coming down to the stream to drink, or to the beaver pond. And bushes started shaking, and something started screaming very monkey like. And it went on for about 20 seconds. And when it stopped, I said, what do you think that is? And he's like, just look for a tree you can get to. It's got to come across water to get to us. But we never heard anything again. And ironically, we just kept fishing. We were all raised in the woods, and we were all taught that there's not anything in the woods that's not more afraid of us than we are of it. And we just went on. And later that year, there was a show called In Search of with Leonard Nimoy, and he had a In Search of Bigfoot episode, and I saw it, and it made me suspicious. And from that time on, I followed everything Bigfoot. And to keep in mind, I'm just a teenager at that point. So before I'd left and went to college for undergraduate, I had found footprints 2 different times, beyond that first time that I'd seen them in the snow. And I saw them one time when I was with my father. We were going back to that beaver dam, and there was a spring there, and there was a footprint in the spring. And then another time, I found it in a clear cut that I was squirrel hunting the edge of. And so I followed the Bigfoot stuff. I read everything that there was to read, and then read. And in the meantime, I went to Iowa for 4 years of doctor school after my initial years, and moved back to West Virginia when I came out, and became a master naturalist. Spent a lot of time in the woods, and of course, following the Bigfoot stuff, I saw that Dr. Jeff Meldrum had a book out, and he was going to speak in Ohio, and it was just a couple hours from me. And I thought, I'm just going to drive up there and listen to him speak. I knew nothing about him in person. I was not in Bigfoot world. I knew nobody there. There's about 300 people at that point. It wasn't very large then. Now, I was up there this year. They had 5,000 people through the weekend. And I listened to Dr. Meldrum speak, talked to him for a while. And interestingly, over the course of the years, he was the one that actually encouraged me to write the first book. And I wrote it. It was called Tracking the Stone Man. But after I had went up to see Dr. Meldrum when I came back, I always tell the story. I was coming back and talking to a friend, and she said, well, what did you think? And I said, well, there were some pretty weird people there. And she's like, well, I don't want to be mean, but you're at this Bigfoot thing, Russ. There's going to be some weird people there. But I remember this, this years ago, 16 years ago, that there was this lady that this guy had told his story about how he saw Bigfoot. And there's this lady in the audience, and and I don't remember now what he said, but he told her the answer, and she shook her head like it explained, his sighting and what had happened. And that's what made me think, I had no idea even what anybody was talking about with that. But when I got back, I had Googled Bigfoot, and of course, BFRO comes up, the Bigfoot Field Research Organization, and they just happened to be having an expedition in Ohio. And I thought, I'm just going to go, and if they're weird, I'll leave. And at that time, Matt Moneymaker from the TV show Finding Bigfoot was going to all the expeditions, and Matt and I just hit it off. And from that point, I started doing all the reports for the group in Ohio and West Virginia. And that was a long time ago now. So that's kind of how I got involved in Bigfoot. And I'd say in the beginning, I thought that there was something out there, but I wasn't sure. It made more sense to me, like so many other people, that it would be in the Pacific Northwest. But once you start interviewing witnesses, and you start going to places, and then you start remembering things that happened to you in your past, you can be as sure as you can be that something exists, without actually seeing it.
So go ahead.
And that's how I got into Bigfoot world.
So you're taking these accounts from people through the BFRO, and I do that as well. I don't get out as much as I'd like to in the woods. I get out on our property as much as I can and look for the signs and these things, because I'm certainly seeking those answers. Are there any reports that stuck out to you over the years when you were collecting reports that were really compelling to you, that you thought were maybe more believable and sort of pushed you in the direction that there might be something out there, maybe more so than others?
I think that's the big deal, So keep in mind now, I've interviewed almost 1,000 witnesses. Some I believed, some I didn't believe. But that's what we're all after is, we all have our own place, like a lot of us, I listen to all the podcasts because I want to hear all the witnesses that you bring and the other people bring, because, knowledge is power, and giving that to you is a chance for you to understand maybe something else about the animal, if it exists or whatever it happens to be. But the very first case that I was on, the very first call that I got was a state policeman in West Virginia, and him and his wife had been riding their four-wheeler, and he was a ginseng hunter. And of course, ginseng, turns a color in the fall, and that's the time that you're allowed to hunt it. But a lot of times people look for it earlier in the year to get an idea of where it could be and whatnot. And so he was putting along on his four-wheeler. His wife was riding on the back, and they had been riding a right of way. And then he kind of cut off and was on a little trail. And he said he glanced up and he saw what he thought was a fire burned stump. And so he stopped and he said, "Have you ever seen one?" And I said, "No." And he said, "They're so large." He's like, "People disappear, and I'm not saying they do it, but they're so large. Just think a sheet of plywood that big." And he said, I glanced back up at it. And he said, of course, he's wearing a pistol. And he said, I just saw it. And he said, I just started slamming the four-wheeler into reverse. And my wife says, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" He said, "Look, look, look, look." And she just started screaming, "Oh my God, no. Oh my God, no." And they tore out of there. And, over the years after it happened, his wife had post-traumatic stress and received counseling. They moved from the country into the city. And even still, if she heard a sound outside, she thought that Bigfoot was in their neighborhood. And I went and met with him, and, he had another trooper with him, and he was chain smoking. He was crying. They were both had their guns out. And I thought, he saw something. And over the years, you take all these reports, and I'm probably taking, at least a report a week, sometimes a couple. And most of them are not very compelling. Most of them, I would say, that are misidentifications, maybe not something that I believe, but every year you'll get those 4 or 5 that are just exceptional. They're an exceptional witness. They saw something very clearly, and those are the ones that keep you going, that compel you, and I understand it's interesting when you talk to law enforcement or to lawyers or whatever, and they'll say, well, the human element, the actual witness testimony is the least compelling of all the evidence that you can collect, whatever it happens to be. And, I know that that's true, but I still think that we should put more weight on witness testimony, if nothing else, just the sure numbers that we have. But the other thing I find it compelling about the witness testimony is usually witnesses, I've noticed, are really not very good with height, weight, distance, but they're really good at being able to tell whether or not something is a human or a bear. And so they may not be able to tell the exact guy that, was at a car wreck and he had a certain color shirt on or whatever it happens to be, but, certainly they're capable. If it's a person that lives in Appalachian that deals with bears all the time, I'm pretty confident that they know what a bear is when, they see one in broad daylight and it's 50 feet from them. So there's a lot of those cases. But, today is, you and I are talking on Sunday. On Wednesday, there was a report that I just took here in West Virginia, just outside of Charleston, maybe 10 minutes from the state capitol. A man, his wife, and their mother-in-law, she wanted to go for a drive, and they were driving in the country up this mountain. It takes 6 miles to get to the top. And as they were climbing up the mountain, they all 3 saw this thing standing. It was 50 yards from them. There were some cattails, a little swampy area right there, and it was about 6 inches to a foot above the cattails. And so, they just couldn't believe it. And so they went down and went to a Walmart and got some casting material to see whether or not, they could find footprints. And they came back and they found 1 footprint, and they videoed it all. And how he knew to do this was he called the police, called the sheriff. He's like, I just saw Bigfoot and I don't know what to do. And he called DNR, and they said they didn't know what to do either. But the deputy he talked to said, the best thing I can tell you is to document everything so that, you can tell everybody what happened. So he has like I don't know how long it is, 7 or 8 minute YouTube video from when the time they clicked on, as soon as they pulled up to go back, and it's just following him as he finds the track and as he pours the casting material and all this other stuff. So I'll meet with him this week and go out. Sadly, we had a severe thunderstorm about 2 hours after he had the sighting. But I'll tell you, Brian, the thing that's so interesting for me is, I have 41 game cameras, I have them out everywhere. And as soon as I'm talking to this guy, I find out that it's on the same road that I took a really good report 7 years prior. So it's compelling to me and more believable because, I'd taken another report, and the other report was this gentleman that was, he's on coal company land. And here people, if you're in Ohio, you may think about Salt Fork is really renowned nationally for Bigfoot sightings, and it has around 20,000 acres. But, here in West Virginia, we may have 3 or 4 coal companies that own that much land just together, and they're not even mining it. There may be several 100,000 acres of land there. And so, you just, people are allowed to hunt where they want to go. And so this gentleman was hunting, and it was on a logging road, but it had been logged about 20 years ago. So a lot of the trees are smaller and they're growing up in the road, and you can't really see really well because it's steep. And he was sitting there, and he heard something coming. Of course, he assumed that it was a deer, and he pulled his rifle up, and he said, I could just see a hand come up, grab this tree, pull itself up. It looked right at me. He said, could see wrinkles underneath the eyes. It had a grayish skin. He said, it looked kind of like a dog's nose, which is commonly what you hear in terms of texture and whatnot. And it just kept going right up the hill. And of course, this is on the same road that this other guy had that sighting. And so this weekend, I'm going over my maps, as I do with so many times, anytime there's a sighting, and there's just nothing special about that area. I mean, it's not a ridge top. It's not a saddle. It's not some place where there's some kind of road. There's just nothing special about it, and it's wild, because you're trying to figure out, why is it that these things would be in certain areas? And a lot of us, I know that there's probably, I don't know, maybe 100 or 200 of us that are very serious about, they're out several times a week, that are talking to witnesses and all the time and actually visiting these places. And, I guess in the long term, the answer is that we just don't have enough data yet to know.
Yeah, I was having some conversations recently. I had Ryan Edwards, a cryptozoologist and author, on the show last week. And then I followed up with a conversation with Lon Strickler. I talked to him, and he's been researching this kind of stuff for decades. And we had some of these very similar conversations, because I used to think, like most people, I think, when they think of Bigfoot, you got to travel like 8 miles in the woods, right? Where Ron Moorhead and these guys collected the Sierra Sounds, 8 miles from the nearest anywhere. And the more that I've studied this subject and the more that I've interviewed people, I believe that these things are more on the fringes of society, like where I live, for example. I had just literally last night, I had this situation where I walk out on my deck to sort of shut everything down. We put the chickens up, and I'm going out to listen around, and I hear something in the woods. And me being me, I jokingly said, I'm going to go out here and do some wood knocks, right? So I grabbed this big stick that I have next to the deck, and I go out and I smack this tree like 3 times. And as soon as I hit the tree the first time, I could hear whatever it was behind the tiny house here, like scampering up the woods. And it was big, so I assumed it was a deer. So I come back up on the deck, and I cut the lights off inside the house, and I just go out on my deck and I stand there, and I kind of do this, where you can cup your ears and you can hear a little bit better than just your normal hearing. And I'm telling you, the farther this thing got away, it sounded like it was on 2 feet. It sounded like a person. And of course, I'm standing there like, holy shit, that sounds like a person. And because I know what a deer sounds like, right? I know what a coon sounds like. We've got some big raccoons around here that get in the bird feeders at night. But, the more I sit there and listen, and this thing's, making its way off. And the thing that compelled me about that situation was how long it took. Because if a deer's running, I'm scared of deer with a wood knock, they're going to take off and they're gone. Like you're going to hear the deer. It's like boom, 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 crash, 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 gone. But this thing was making its way up the ridge to the left of the house out here. And I was like, I don't know. And I'm certainly not saying it was a Bigfoot by any stretch of the imaginations. It was dark and I didn't see anything, but just the sound in and of itself of something that sounded bipedal versus some kind of ungulate that was running away. I don't know. It's sort of compelling to me. But when I have these conversations with folks about the eyewitness accounts, for example, I believe, like you, that sometimes the anecdotal evidence in these reports that we take from people who have these encounters, you have to sift through the madness, of course. And I've had people on the show that I've went back and listened to their accounts, and I'm like, man, I'm not so sure that happened that way. I believe that they had some sort of encounter, but I'm not sure exactly if everything they're telling me is entirely accurate. Okay.
Right.
I was going back through the archives, and I'm sort of trying to go back. And now that I've learned how to podcast, I'm trying to go back and take some of these very early on shows with some really, really good stuff in them and try to remaster them so it's actually so people can actually listen to it and enjoy it. So I was listening to one. It was show number 3. It was Dave that I had from, I think it was Wisconsin somewhere, and it's called Bigfoot Hunts with Coyotes. Now, when I first interviewed this guy, he was telling me some things that were just really out there. He was claiming that he was hearing, and these things were using like barred owl calls, and they were mimicking barred owls. In and of itself, I'm always a little skeptical when people say these things mimic things, because how do you know it's not just a barred owl, right?
Right.
You know, so he was claiming these things, and he was claiming that he was getting very close to these things to the point of almost feeding a female at arm's length. And he claimed that he knew they domesticated coyotes and hunted with them. The big males were hunting with coyotes. So when I first put this show out, I was really sort of scratching my head. And I think I did a disclaimer in the beginning of the intro, like, look, I'm just putting this out there. I'm not necessarily saying that I believe this guy's story 100%. I do believe he's had some encounters. I'm just not so sure about everything, you know. And he went into detail about being blasted with infrasound. And I pushed him. I was like, so was this a yell? Was it a scream? He's like, no, I didn't hear anything. It was I just got blasted with infrasound because this thing was close. I smelled it, and then it was close. So, you know, I go back and listen to some of those stories, and I believe that they're still the best evidence, in my opinion, that we have at this point, because we're sitting here, it's June 26th as we record this, 2022. And we feel, or at least I feel, we're no closer to proving that these things are actually real. Right. So that's why I continue. It pushes me on to continue to do the show and continue to interview the people who claim to have these encounters, because I do this full time. I do 3 podcasts. I don't have time to get out into the woods and really seek those answers myself. But I know people like you who do. And you're not an armchair researcher. You actually get boots on the ground into the woods. And in addition to that, you went out and got your Master Naturalist certification. So I want to talk a little bit about that and what that means. If you wouldn't mind, let's sort of go down that path and sort of tell the audience what drove you into that and what that consisted of.
Okay. So many states have Master Naturalist program. Some are better than others. Same way with Master Gardener programs. Like in West Virginia, a Master Naturalist is someone that takes classes from a university professor. You essentially, it took 1 year. It was every other weekend, and every other weekend on that Friday night from 6 to 9, there would be a lecture on a topic: trees, snakes, salamanders, ferns, anything you can imagine would be in there. And then the next day at 9 in the morning to noon, we were in the field actually covering whatever that topic was that we addressed the night before. So, you know, there was 30 something that started of us. There was only 2 that finished in a year, because if you miss a class, you have to wait till the following year to be able to take it. There's other states, like my home state, Ohio, has a Master Naturalist program, but it's kind of like our Master Gardener program here in West Virginia. I completed it, but it was like 10 classes and you didn't have to show up to some of them. It just wasn't very serious. Now, some of the people are pretty serious to take it, but you know, in West Virginia, it's a big deal, and it's recognized as one of the very top ones in the country. And then inside that group, you know, you would have people that are better at some things than other things. Like, you know, I'm pretty good at birds and trees, but there's other people that are better at wildflowers or other subjects, whatever happens to be. And, you know, we provide, like, for many years, I was responsible for this one large, it was called the First Walk of the Year, that would be at the largest state park in West Virginia. And I'd be in charge of having that walk each year, and people would come out, and a Master Naturalist would lead them through and discuss a subject each year. And it's just another way of looking at the woods when you go in. I mean, I think that many times in Bigfoot world right now, the evidence, or the collecting evidence, the collecting reports is being done largely by citizen scientists, and in the second book, I talk about citizen scientists and what that means in terms of the evidence, and is sitting at a campfire, cooking bacon with your friends, hoping to hear something, is that research? And if it is, and if you hear something, how do you go about it or whatever? But, it's just trying to compel people that we needed to take our research a little more serious about what we're doing and establish, if you're on Facebook and you see all these trees being bent over and people claiming they're Bigfoot type evidence when there's really no evidence, where the footprints that you see are just these blobs of a scuff or something, and I'm telling you, there's scientists that are genuinely interested in the Bigfoot field, but they're horrified by how the people in the field look at evidence, and they're horrified by woo, which when I started Bigfoot, there really was no such thing as woo around. There was Tom Powell, which is an author, great guy, really bright, out on the West Coast, wrote the book The Locals, which is probably one of the best Bigfoot books ever written. And Tom was in the BFRO, and he would take some of the weird reports, as he would say, and he enjoyed doing those. And there really wasn't any of the rest of us that were doing any of that type of woo thing. But as time went on, it just becomes more prevalent. And I think it's prevalent because we have a society that largely isn't in the woods anymore. They don't know the trees. They don't know the animals. They don't know what the animals eat. They don't know where to find them. They are afraid of the dark. They're afraid of getting lost. They're afraid of snakes. And, so then all of a sudden they're out in the woods for a Bigfoot expedition. They're not commonly in the woods. They're very excited to be there. They're not sleeping that well. They're up until, 2 a.m. They're normally not up that late. All of a sudden they think that they hear something in the woods, and then they get a little nauseous. They get dizzy. They believe they got zapped, when in most cases there's a perfectly ordinary explanation physiologically for something like that happening. Now, is it possible that Bigfoot zaps? Sure, but I mean, that's a little ways down the road. Same way as stick structures, some of the other great apes manipulate trees, manipulate things like that. So it seems pretty reasonable to me that Bigfoot would as well. But if you look back with Indian accounts, there's just not anything like that. The Native Americans don't talk about that. I have a hard time believing that if Simon Kenton and Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett were in the woods hunting, like our forefathers did, that if something was manipulating trees all the time, they would have known about it. They would have been conscious of it, and we would have known more about it historically. But so I think that there might be something there, but we need to take a step to get there.
I think that's a really good point. And I've said it before, and I say it continuously. I think shows like Finding Bigfoot and some of these other Expedition Bigfoot and things that have put Bigfoot on the map and made it more streamlined or more easily discussed in these times that we're in currently. And even my show has probably contributed in some ways negatively to the phenomenon, because I've even done it myself. I went on hikes recently and I found things on my property like stick structures, right? Or these things that have fallen, sticks that are bent in certain ways that don't look natural to me. And I take pictures of them and I put them out on the social media and I say, look, I found this interesting thing, because it is fascinating to me that I see these things and I don't have a natural explanation for them. It doesn't look natural to me. But I never say definitively, hey, a Sasquatch built this, or hey, a Sasquatch made this. I just say, hey, this is interesting. What do you guys think? And of course, I get the people that say, hey, you've got Bigfoot on your property. Hey, man, that's a Bigfoot. Well, I can't say that, right? Because I didn't see it do it. But I think that's a very good point, because scientists don't want to have conversations about things that aren't scientific, right? You start talking about evidence and the footprints. It's one of the things that I talked to Ryan Edwards about recently when I had him on the show. And I've talked about it with plenty of people, Jeff Meldrum. the footprint evidence is what everybody sort of points to. When I say, what is the definitive defining evidence for you at this point that these things are real? And most people say footprints.
Mhm.
Well, it's like the conversation I had with Ryan recently. You know, he's very big into the scientific approach to this, and I really appreciate that about him. And I said, you know, I had a conversation with Jeff Meldrum about a year ago, and he had me convinced. It was enough for me at the time, you know, about a year and a half ago now, that the footprint evidence that he's examined is enough. Well, to me, it's not at this point, because
Mhm.
if there's footprints, there's got to be more. And I just don't understand at this point why we don't have more. So I've been very cantankerous recently on the show, and it's a point of frustration for me because I want to get answers and I want to move forward in my journey. You know, I enjoy doing the show. I love talking to people about their encounters, but at the end of the day, I've had encounters and I've had experiences for myself that I can't explain. So I want to find answers. And I've read the books and I've done the research and I've talked to the people, but we don't have anything any more definitive than footprints. So
Yeah.
I guess for me, my question for you is, what do you think is the most definitive evidence we've had to date? Is there been film? Is there anything that sticks out to you, or is it footprints for you as well?
It's footprints, but I think that the problem is right from the start with collecting evidence is I think that people discount or don't recognize how rare the animal is. Um, for instance, what I believe is that during the day that they largely stay back and um, they're in a place where people seldom go, people aren't around. And then as time goes on, it gets closer to evening, they're creeping up, much like the big bucks do. And then when it's dark, like you said, they're living on the edges of the fringe. I mean, we only control our land during the daytime. And at night, anything goes. And, you start thinking about, for instance, I gave a talk one time about, that was just strictly on where are the bones, because you would think that we would find some bones, right? And I started talking about, how many of these things would there be, and so, North America, United States and Canada, best guess, I'm going to say that, and this is just a guess, say it's between 4,000 and 20,000 animals, 4,000 being low, because that seems to be what everybody would accept is that, you can breed with a lower population, but you're having sightings all across North America and Canada. So something in British Columbia isn't breeding with something in North Carolina, probably, right? So, I mean, so let's just say that there's 4,000 of them, and just choose that number and say that they live about as long as other great apes, which is, about 40, 50 years, and then about 5% of them die a year. So, in all of North America, you're talking about 200 animals that have died. Then you start dividing it out by states. In Appalachia and most states, you might have between 5 and 10 dead animals in a whole state. And you start breaking it down like that and say there's, in the county you live in and the 3 surrounding it, there may be 1 Bigfoot that died in there. It's hard to find your dog when you're coon hunting and your dog's not trying to avoid you, I assure you, but it just disappears, it's gone. And you're relying on somebody to, with a tag to call you and say, hey, I got your dog, or whatever it happens to be. And so going back to why it's hard to get evidence, I find I'm out as much as anybody. I'm out 3 or 4 times a week. And then about every couple of months, I'll be out for a whole week at a time. And maybe I find footprints a couple of times a year. Where I live in Appalachia, it's not really conducive to footprints. It's, I think that they're cognizant, like mountain lions and chimpanzees, of leaving their prints. So, you have animals that are not common that are leery of leaving their prints. And during the day, they're staying back, away from where humans would be and creeping up at night. So recently there's this park that, it's pretty close to me, within an hour. there's a history of Bigfoot sightings there. When Finding Bigfoot did their special episode, was it last year, year before last now, that's where I took them, to do the show, and they had action in there or whatever. But, I think that the animals stay back. So for me, hiking, where I get to where they would be, or I believe that they would be, it's a 3.5 mile walk, and I'm going uphill for the first 1.5 miles and then running along ridges. So I get 3.5 miles out there. I still have to come back 3.5 miles. So what am I going to do when I'm out there? Am I going to put a camera, which, I'm putting out, but I know it's 30 decibels. And so, animals can hear it. There's already been studies showing that. There was a book that was written about Siberian tigers and how, the first guy to ever get pictures of them had put 32 cameras out, and they found 30 of them had been attacked from behind. So, there's something going on with the cameras. So, what are you going to do? Because you're not going to stay out there. You got to go home. You're not allowed camping in state parks except for campgrounds. So, these animals generationally know where people go, know where people don't go. They are in these little hollows that, people just seldom venture to. So I think that, it was 2 days ago on Twitter, I posted it was Grover Krantz's 90th birthday. And of course, Grover Krantz was the first scientist that was interested in Bigfoot. And I said, what would he think now, at 90, if he was here? Would he be surprised at where we were? Would he be disappointed? I think he would probably smile and not be surprised because of how frustrating it can be. So I think that, there's things that are improving. Our technology is improving. I think that we have better ideas about different things than we did previously. But the hard thing is, we're all doing it part-time. Even as much time as I spend in the woods, I look in the mirror, I can see scratches and briar marks from where I was out this weekend in the woods. And, but the weekend's over. And so nobody's out there again. And so those animals have the woods to themselves, not only at night, during the week. And as I was driving back from Ohio to West Virginia, I'm just looking at these places and I'm thinking, no one even goes over there. No one goes over there. And a lot of times I'll put cameras up when remote places, like the only access point, a trail or a road that's gated or something, just to get an idea of how many people are going into these areas. And even in a place like Ohio that has relatively few remote places, there's not very many people out there. And I know here, I think it was last month, I was doing a radio show, and it was I did one for Toronto and one for New Orleans, and they were saying, well, it seems like if there was something like that out there, that somebody would have found it. And I was like, I'm just wondering who somebody is. I'm the only person out there. I never see anybody. I mean, I know that when I go into the woods, that even if it's a busy state park, that I'm there early in the morning, I'm way back in the woods, and I don't see anybody until I'm within a quarter to a half mile of my vehicle coming back. No one's out that far. And a lot of times with the cameras, that's how I determine where I go. Is I'll have a camera up and I'll watch each and every person that's going in and out to a place, and I just time them on my camera, and it gives me an idea of what's the farthest someone's going into this particular area. And so then that gives you a starting point of, if you're going to get where other people don't go, I have to go at least this far. So I think it's primarily the lack of the rarity of the animal is the primary issue. And I think that that's discounted. When you start looking at, is there fossil evidence and all this other stuff? I mean, whatever Bigfoot came across the Bering Strait 10 to 20,000 years ago. It takes 10,000 years generally for most fossils to show up. There may not even be a fossil. Most of the places where fossils are found, or places where Bigfoot is known to be acidic soil and that type of thing. And of course, we all know how many things. I gave one lecture just on how much stuff eats bones. It's a shocking number of animals, including deer, that eat bones. So I think that if we're in the woods, that you and I, if we saw a bone, we probably wouldn't pick it up unless it was some skull, like if it was a skull that looked human, of course, we'd probably call whoever we were going to call or whatever, but that'd be the only thing we'd be interested in. Any other thing we would assume, if it's pretty big, it's like, on the East Coast, we like, oh, somebody had a cow that was back here or whatever it happened to be. I mean, I just don't see us picking most of that stuff up. And every year here, I mean, trees are everywhere in Appalachia. And every year we get the leaf cover, and all the little rodents and everything else eating, things that's underneath. I did see that there was a skull of a sloth that was 9,000 years old that had been discovered in West Virginia just about a month ago. So, it always leaves you hope that maybe somebody's going to find this skull that looks human-like.
Yeah, I agree. And I have to talk myself into that a lot of times because I get so frustrated with the lack or what appears to be the lack of evidence. And then I talk to people who go out on Bigfoot expeditions with people who charge money to go out and look for Bigfoot. And I believe, like you, I challenged a guy recently I had on the show who had been out with Todd Standing. And he was actually going out like a couple of days after I did the interview. He was going back. It actually started this past Monday. They were going back out on a second expedition. And I said to him, all the things that happened on that expedition, do you think it's possible that that's stuff's being faked? Because you make a very good point about the expeditions, right? You're out there, you're tired, you're not sleeping well, you're camping in the woods for 3 or 4 days, and then everything becomes about Bigfoot.
Yeah.
And I think we have to be very careful of that. But again, like you said, when you put it in perspective, the numbers of these things, and I've talked to many people about what they believe the population might be. And if they're really as low as I think they are, I think they're probably closer to, maybe 5 or 10,000 at the most across the country. That makes sense because you're not going to run into them. And despite popular belief with all the Bigfoot podcasts and all the Bigfoot shows, there are very few people, like you said, maybe 100, 150 that are really out there as much as they possibly can be. And they're still missing 95% of the time that they could be in the woods looking for these things. So when I hear things like that, it gives me a little bit sort of a breath of fresh air, if you would, to push me forward, because it's easy to get frustrated. And I know for you, obviously you go out and spend the time and do that. It's got to be even more frustrating for you that we're not any closer to finding these answers. And I think about people like John Bendernagel and Grover Krantz and the people that were in the fight for so long to try to discover these animals. I had the opportunity to talk to Peter Byrne. I had him on the show last month or so. And I disagree with a lot of the things he said because he's very specific about, I don't think these things are west of the Rockies, right?
Yeah.
And when you take as many reports as I have from the southeastern United States, for example, I don't believe that they're not here because of the amount of people that have seen them, incredible witnesses that I believe. So,
right.
When you're going out in the woods, what are you taking out as far as equipment? You mentioned cameras a couple of times. I've had so many conversations about why these things don't show up on game cams. And I think you're on to the very same thing that Doug Hychek and I've talked about it many times about the infrared and the sound that these cameras make. What are you taking out in the woods with you? And what is your goal when you go out as far as finding evidence? Are you just kind of haphazard, or do you have sort of a method to the madness when you go out looking for these things?
So what I do is when I started, the big mistake that I made was I was spreading myself too thin. I would go to every single report that someone called me, no matter how old or fresh it was, ambulance chasing. I was I might have been in the high mountains of North Carolina one weekend. The next weekend I was in the high mountains in West Virginia or Ohio. I was spread too thin. I wasn't spending enough time in each area. And now I've gotten where when I go into an area, I walk every creek, I walk every trail, I walk every ridge, and until I have everything covered. And every time I take notes on, the environmental conditions and what my thoughts are when I came out, if I heard something. I mean, 99% of the time, literally, you do not hear anything when you're out during the day. I usually am not out at night at all anymore, unless I'm just with friends, because I just think night is for experiences and it's not for evidence. I mean, the only thing that people are getting at night is some, FLIR footage, and the professionals, the scientists, are not compelled by it at all. Even so, some of it's pretty good. And frankly, some of the pictures around the country, I'm sure, are real, that are good, but no one believes anything anymore. You know, the technology's improved so much that that's why I think it's really going to, you know, I know a couple of months ago, Cliff Berkman and I were talking, and one of the guys doing some of the DNA testing, he said that he felt compelled that if you could get some game cam footage with some, footprint evidence and some, some FLIR footage and maybe witness testimony, combine it all, that would be enough. And it sounds interesting, but I just don't think it's enough. I just don't think that anybody's going to believe it until we have, a coal truck in West Virginia hits one, or a hunter in West Virginia, of which I've interviewed 3 that had clear shots that could have shot it if they want to. And I think that's probably what's going to happen. It's going to be, one's going to be hit on the road, one's going to be shot by a hunter, or I know Matt Pruitt had told me that he thought that it might be a habituate, or somebody that, lives in the country and they're bothering their chickens or whatever, might be the person that gets one. But what I'm convinced of for sure is that when it's been proven, when it's been accepted, everybody's going to be shocked at how much evidence is out there that comes forward all at once. I'm convinced there's people that are sitting on video, camera, maybe even have bones, where they shot one or whatever, and people are just, they don't want to look like a kook. They don't want to seem weird, and they're just holding stuff back. And a lot of us are, the witnesses that we interview, compelling witnesses like mayors and police chiefs that will come to you and tell you, this is the story and this is what happened, but I don't want you to tell anybody. I don't want you to tell my name. I just want somebody to know. They have no reason for coming forward. It makes a lot more sense for them not to come forward. So, I feel like that I know, and I don't want to sound arrogant when I say this, but I feel like that I know a lot more than I did 15 years ago about what they're like and what their behaviors are. But, like I said, I was looking at a map the other day, and, one of the things I always tell everybody is, as soon as you get a report, you got to try to figure out why that animal was there. Why was it there? Where was it going? Why isn't that spot? And almost always you look at it on the map, and in West Virginia or Southeast Ohio, it's not any different area than every place else that you look. There's just not a reason. I remember there was a scientist that, she's on some of the Bigfoot shows, but, she was curious about the camera setups, like, where do you do those? And of course, you're on a flat, you're on a ridge, you're on a stream, you're on, just the typical stuff that we would all be on. Keep in mind, we're not setting up on fields because, you don't want to look at, 5,000 pictures literally of deer, because a lot of the cameras I'm leaving out at least a year. The battery life on the Reconyx cameras are about 1.5 years with lithium batteries. So many times when I pull them, I'll have several thousand pictures on there, that I have to go through. Some weekends I went through 15,000 pictures, and, you're just flipping. And of all that time, maybe hundreds of thousands of pictures you looked at, you may have 15 or 20 that are compelling, that you think something was going on, but nothing that you have a clear shot on. And of course, that's what we're all after. But now I talk to people about, as I started putting my cameras in the same areas, maybe I had 12 in one park, I started noticing more about the animals. So I would notice I had the same 12 deer or the same 20 deer, or whatever it happens to be. But then I started noticing that when you're out for a long period of time and you're leaving those cameras in place, you'll find that in the course of a year, there'll be 1 or 2 times where you don't have animal action that's normal. You see less coyotes, you see less, everything, less deer, whatever it happens to be. So something is in your area disrupting the wildlife. And I think that we need to pay attention to that too. It's not a Bigfoot picture, but it could be something to keep in mind in terms of the area that you're working, that you want to be in there during that particular time. I sometimes have went in I keep a calendar of all this kind of stuff that happens. That's when I'm in the woods or decides where I go. And 2 years ago, I was in this place, and 2 years before that, on the exact week, 2 guys had a sighting that was very good and compelling sighting. So here I am the same week, 2 years later, in the same place, just hoping. And I'm walking Shade, my lab that's always with me. And and he listens good. He's always about 20 feet in front of me. And I carry a leash around my neck in case I happen to run into somebody and they're afraid of dogs or something. I'm coming along this hillside, and I see about 50 yards from me, in my brain, it said hiker with a backpack, and he was buff collared all the way down. And I mean, I just looked for an instant because it was a hunter, or it was a hiker. And I just whistled at shade, and I went down on one knee. I clipped him on. Probably wasn't 10 seconds. I was walking again. As soon as I started walking, I recognized that what I had seen was off trail then. The trail was turning, and it was in a pawpaw patch, and it was just over the pawpaws. And then I was suspicious, so there was a ridge right there, and I ran to the ridge where I could look all around, and there was nothing there, so I thought that was in all likelihood my first Bigfoot sighting, but not really the way that I wanted to have one. But what I recognized was that sometimes when you're in the woods a lot and you've been that way your whole life, that it can be a disadvantage because your brain wants to categorize everything instantly on what it knows and to put it in a category. So now before I go in the woods, I tell myself, when you hear a noise, pause. When you see something, don't just pause, just make yourself do it. I mean, last year I was in this new place I was working, and it was in the middle of the day, and I heard a tree fall, and it wasn't very far from me, but I knew when it fell, I thought, it's too big to be anything. And I just kind of went on. Then later I'm thinking, well, it's like 100 yards from you. Why would you just not walk over and take a look? But because of all that happening, now I use a GoPro all the time. I have a hiking staff. It's on my staff. I train myself that wherever I'm looking, my cane is just being, their staff is just being looked that same way. I carry extra batteries in my left pocket. It lasts about 45 minutes or an hour, and then it beeps, and I just change them out and move on. And I put the used ones in the other pocket so I don't get them confused or whatever it happens to be. But I, like Doug Highcheck, Doug and I are good friends and talk a lot, believe that if someone had exceptional 4D quality video, several seconds of it, it might be compelling to some people. Not unlike the Patterson Gimlin film, but of course we have much better quality film now. So that being said, I've been in the woods an awful lot, and I haven't seen anything beyond that one thing that I just told you that I thought that was a Bigfoot. Now, have I heard things? Now, have I found tracks? Sure. But it's just not very easy to see things like this time of the year. You have to be out in the morning because it's too hot. It's too thick in Appalachia to be off trail largely. So you're always on the trail. So, these animals are more active at night, and they don't always make noises. So, I think most of the time we're probably just walking right by them.
Yeah, I tend to agree. And I want to talk a little bit about the vocalizations, because that's something that's been very compelling to me since I really got into the subject. And I've had several people on the show just to talk about, I've had David Ellis on the show to go over some of Julie Wrench's stuff that she's recorded here in North Carolina.
Yeah.
And I found it very convincing in a lot of cases that, a lot of what I hear, I believe to be coyotes, and I think it's fox and other things. Is there anything that stuck out to you? What do you think about the vocalizations and what people are capturing? Do you think the majority of that stuff is just known animals and it's being misidentified, or do you think there's something to the vocalizations?
I do think that there is. I mean, I'm good friends with, on the East Coast, we have Monongahela, which is, David Ellis's friend, and kind of who got him into it. And I brought Monongahela into the BFRO, and that's who largely does most of our recordings. But many of the guys that are doing the LDR work, they're doing it not only because they're interested in that particular kind of work, but sometimes they have a type of job where they just can't get into the woods that often. So then as a result, they're doing that. I had bought some of the really expensive ones that, Cornell University had, I think the Lab of Ornithology had one that they were letting people do for bird work. And there was another one that was from Acoustic Wildlife, and I had bought one of theirs. And then I'd had a couple that were made for me. I wanted to put them in, I have a farm in Ohio that adjoins a park. I adjoined the park for 3/4 of a mile. I'm on a dead end road. There's been Bigfoot sightings there. And so as I age and I'm there or more, I'm going to try to habituate something. I'm not sure they stay there all the time. but I wanted to put a recorder out to get an idea and keep track of it all year. But what I found was that there was just too much noise now for David or for Monongahela, Dr. Kenny Brown out of Ohio that does a lot of LDR stuff. Those guys will tell you that they'll go through a whole night in just like 8 or 10 minutes, just to, they fly through it. But where they're at largely is areas where there's not that much noise. But in the fringes of society where you live or where my farm is, the reality is there's a lot of noise within sound that you can hear. So when I was doing it, it was taking too much time, and I just decided that I was better served doing other things. And so now I have Dr. Brown works one of the same areas as I do, and he helps me with my calendar. He has 3 or 4 different LDRs out and will tell me what he heard and when he heard it. Now, I know generally they're looking for more than one thing because, for instance, I remember I asked Monongahela, I said, so, like I hear woods, trees pop, it's the sap going up or down. How do you know that when you hear a wood knock that it's not that? And he said, you don't. He's like, it sounds like the same thing. But he's like, so I'm trying to put something together. Did I hear something with that? Did I hear a whoop or I heard something other kind of noise with that? And so I rely on those guys when a witness gives me something recorded or in those areas that I'm working to help me try to figure out where they are to increase the data. So when I go into the woods, I'm increasing my odds of just being there at the right time to be able to collect some type of evidence, whatever, that happens to be. I think it's interesting and compelling that there's unidentified sounds that are on both coasts that are the same thing. We have birds that are the same type but look a little different on each side of the coast that make similar sounds. And in the same way, the footprints, there's laws of nature that, animals get larger as they go the farther north. The footprints do too, and that was one of the things that was pointed out, in the 70s in some of the early books, that some of the early evidence they looked at. And I think that people overlook things like that. Is it reasonable that someone is faking footprints for the last 50 years? And not only are they faking them, are they making sure that the tracks in Florida on average are smaller than the tracks on average in Canada? Are they somewhere in between in Ohio? It just seems unreasonable to me that that would be, happening that way. And so when you add that to the body of evidence, I think that at the very least, when I did the first book, that was one of the things that I was just trying to make an argument. I said 5 things that I thought that Bigfoot may be, but you just spent a couple of paragraphs on it because I wanted people just to read it and just say at the end, maybe somebody should look at this. Maybe it's not unreasonable, to do that. But like you had said, there's 100, 200 people in a nation that are legitimately consumed with it. I listen to podcasts the whole day. If I'm not seeing patients, I have earbuds in and I'm listening to podcasts. I'm caught up on all the podcasts that do Bigfoot. There's usually just not enough of them for me, to do. I'm consumed with that all the time, finding times when I'm in the woods. When I'm sitting here on the couch, I'm looking at maps all the time, just trying to see something. Like, for instance, a few years ago in West Virginia, they had the Cranberry Wilderness area. You have the Monongahela National Forest, which is 1.1 million acres. And inside of it, they have 5 wilderness areas. And one of them is called Cranberry, and it's the largest wilderness area on the East Coast. And, when you're there, you're 20 miles for cell service. There's just nobody there and nobody around. But people drive through there. There's a road that goes through there. And I had a nurse that was driving through there. It was the daytime. She thought it was a bear. She sees bears all the time on the road. It's a bear sanctuary. And she saw it kind of slip on the hillside. And then this road that she's on, she's coming down a mountain. So everybody's coasting. So, there's just not that sound. And I think they catch things unaware on that road. And she said as it slipped, it reached up and grabbed a branch, and then it turned and looked at her, and she was really bright and just a good witness. And I was compelled and interested. And of course, anytime you go up there, you know, just like every place else in West Virginia, you're like, what do I do now? Because the next road's 11 miles from me, and it took me 30 minutes to climb the first mountain, and there's 9 more behind it. And but then a couple of years later, I got this call, and it was from a medical doctor, and him and his wife were going to work at the hospital, and you know, it's like a 45-minute drive for them. They're driving that same road, same hill. He looks down in the hill road in front of him, and he says to his wife, you know, what's that guy doing wearing a monkey costume in the middle out here in the middle of nowhere? And then he said he realized that it just took 3 steps to get across that 2-lane road. And he stopped there where it crossed. He told his wife, we just saw Bigfoot. And so then I was ate up for weeks and weeks and weeks. You know, why is it that they're crossing in this one place? You know, what is it that's about this place that's so compelling? You know, like if we could just figure that out, that's like with the cameras, that I think that those of us that do cameras, that if one of us can figure out exactly how it's done to get a picture, then a lot of us will do it. You know, and so we always have to be evolving our ideas on how we're doing it. You know, like the scientists, you know, they're in South America and they're trying to get a picture of a known species right now. They've tried 2 years now, don't have a picture of it yet. They are putting their cameras up every 50 feet. They have 200 cameras. And so if a camera comes and it's right behind a tree, that's just where it goes. But, you know, we don't do that. We have, you know, maybe I have 12 cameras in a park that's, you know, 20,000 acres. And, you know, I'm trying to get something to walk within 50 feet of one of my cameras, and it's probably hearing it. So then I have to try to put it, you know, by a creek or something else that I think that's maybe going to block that noise a little bit to try to disguise it. Or I'm using cheaper game cameras to try to shape movement toward an area where I think I have a really good setup and I could fool something, you know. So it's a challenge, but I love it, you know, and I'm consumed with it.
Yeah, I'm glad that you're out there doing that stuff, because we've said it already, there's not a ton of people out that are trying to get the evidence. And I think it's important for those of us that are seeking those answers to have those kind of things going on and doing it in a scientific way. I know you wrote the first book and the second book is out. Why don't we talk a little bit about what's the second book called and what is that second book about?
So the second book is the Appalachian Bigfoot. And it came out, I think, the second week of December. And, you know, when you write a book, you're never sure how it's going to do. I know I talked to Lauren Coleman before I did the first one, and he told me that, you know, if you sold 1,000 copies, it would be awesome. 3,000 would be like unbelievable. And so the first one did well. And in 6 years, it had sold around 5,000 copies. But frankly, it's because, you know, the practice I'm in is large, and I think a lot of the patients are interested in it. So a lot of the patients are buying the book. And I wrote it because one of my patients had brought me this book, and it was like, I don't remember exactly the name. I was like Bigfoot in West Virginia or something. And he said, you know, this guy, and I mean, you know how Bigfoot world is. All of us kind of know each other or have heard of whoever. And it wasn't somebody I knew. And he's like, oh, it's this college professor in West Virginia. Well, when I read it, he had like an opening chapter and an ending chapter, and the rest of his chapters were just reports that I had published that he put in there. And I was like, gosh. And so I decided, you know, hey, it was about time. I did about 500 witnesses by then. It was time for me to, I mean, after a while, you've done so many that when you go back through your notes, many of the witnesses, you don't even remember talking to them. You know, they're just a point on your map and, you know, one of the bunch of notebooks that you have around. And so I did that one. And then before COVID started, I had started in on another one, and COVID came and I kind of sat it aside for a while. And then I moved, and I didn't have really a place that I felt comfortable writing. And I kind of waited, and then I got rolling again on it. And like I said, it came out in December. It was #1 on Amazon for 17 weeks. It's done shockingly well, humbling, you know, that people are so interested in, you know, reading what you have to say about Bigfoot of all things, you know. And who thinks that, you know, you go to school for 10 years and you think, you know, 20 years from now, I'm writing some Bigfoot books, or 30 years, I guess it is. But, you know, it's funny how those things, you know, turn out like that. But the first book was largely about West Virginia, but I had some concepts in it, some theories, I believe. One was about these things I call treat foods. Another was about things I called perches, which were just theories I was starting to put forth about Bigfoot behavior. And then when I did the second one, it was encompassing Appalachia, talking to who I considered the best researchers in Appalachia, going through and finding the best reports in Appalachia that were either published or unpublished, and putting them in the public's eye. And then if it wasn't something I did, trying to go and talk to the witness again and to the person that investigated it. And then just trying to give people an idea about things I consider when I go into the woods. For instance, I have a chapter on bird language, and I talk about how really hard it is to go into the woods. And for instance, now we know in science that, a lot of the animals, the bobcats, the coyotes, the predators, recognizing certain birds that are in certain areas, like, say in West Virginia, we have, in Appalachian general, we'd have around 200 and something birds. And then during winter, we may have, just a couple dozen that are in the more northern states, but the birds recognize those. And so a home range is just about the size of a football field. For some birds, maybe like a blue jay or a crow, well, it may be a little bit larger than that, but they're all overlapping. And when you pay attention, when you're in the woods, you can hear those birds as you're moving from one area, one territory to another, alarming everything around you. And so then now we've learned that a lot of the animals that can smell well, not only do they set up for the winds in their favor, or they can see things better, but they are listening for particular birds alarming at a distance. And those birds will tell you, they'll even predator, whether it's something on the ground or whether it's something in the air. And, I think that they're listening to those things. I just don't think it's possible for people to creep up on things like that. But I was just trying to give people an idea, as someone that comes from a science background and has a science degree, that has hunted their whole lifetime and is also a master naturalist. When I go in the woods, how I'm looking at it from my perspective. And I'm not saying that, it's interesting, like we need all of us. We need someone taking all the reports so that, they're out there and we know, and we're hearing the same things repetitiously. So we recognize certain things, behaviors. And then we need people that, are organizing different types of professionals. There's room for all. And we need people that are going to be in the woods that, are doing things. But I want to tell you, I was up at the Ohio Bigfoot Conference, which is the largest one in the world. And that was in May, I want to say, at this park, which is probably the most renowned park in the whole country for Bigfoot sightings, certainly the most well-known. You're at the largest conference. There's all these dumpsters here. So, if something's around, they're dumpster diving, they're going all these trash cans and all this other stuff. But just maybe a couple 100 yards from the lodge, and I watched all weekend and I didn't see anybody go down there. I'm thinking, here we are in this Bigfoot park, this huge conference, all these people here, but no one's walking down there to see, what's dead. Because it might have been that one Bigfoot of 5 in the whole state of Ohio that were dead that someone could have found, and it could all have been over with. But we're all living our lives. It's when people talk to you about Bigfoot, most of the people aren't interested. They're living their life. They have kids, they have a job, they have a spouse, they have things going on they're interested in and they're doing. Maybe it's about COVID, or maybe it's about whatever it happens to be. But for not very many of us, it's about Bigfoot. And I think that when people sit down and talk with someone that's knowledgeable about Bigfoot and the evidence that's out there and the reports that are out there, that they'll become compelled with that person or with that subject after and find it interesting. But, everybody thinks they're interested in Bigfoot until they meet somebody like you or I. Then they realize that maybe I'm not that interested in it, or I'm interested, but not as much as other people are.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. You go to the conferences and, like you said, you meet people who are interested in the subject, but they can't see the forest for the trees in some cases because they get hyper focused on whatever that interest is. and they're missing the boat entirely on finding, it could be that one thing that they're not investigating or not checking out that could be the end all be all for the subject. But like you said, I'm compelled by the subject. I believe it 5 days out of 7. I'm right there. I have those days like everybody where I'm just like, is any of this real? But ultimately, I continue to do the show and I continue to talk to people because I am very interested in the subject. And I hope in my lifetime that we get more answers than we have questions, because sometimes I go to bed and I just feel like I've got more questions than answers, but that's
I
what keeps you
understand.
going, right? It's interesting. It's an interesting subject. Dr. Russ Jones, man, I've had a blast talking to you. I really appreciate you coming on the show. I will link to the books in the show notes for everybody to go out and pick up their copy. I really appreciate you coming on.
Hey, if anybody wants to reach out, thebigfootdoc.com. They can find a link to the book. They can send me an email if they want to tell me a story. And I appreciate you having me on, Brian. I'm a big fan and I always listen, and I appreciate your time.
Absolutely. I will link to that as well. You guys check it out in the show notes. Well, that was awesome, man. I figured it would be.
I hope I kept you awake for an hour or so.
You did. I was not having any issue staying engaged. That's for sure.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear that.
Well, it sounds like you
Hopefully
have.
we'll get to meet in person sometime.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say maybe, I'm starting to get out now that I'm doing this full time. We're going to like I said, the Smoky Mountain Bigfoot Conference is the closest one to me that I can actually go
Yes.
and do a vendor spot. So I'm looking forward to getting out. I met Matt Pruitt there last year, so the trip was worth it just to meet Matt and make that connection.
That's awesome, dude. I always say that if we had 100 Matt Pruitts, the Bigfoot thing would be solved. One of the sharpest dudes around. And, I'll tell you, I was at a couple years ago, I was speaking in Ohio, and it was Meldrum and Barrickman and I think Bobo might have been the fourth. They always have four, but Cliff was asking me what I was in the woods doing, because I'm always doing all these weird things. And I had mirrors up and all this other stuff and peanut butter out and all this other stuff. And Cliff told me, yeah. Ironically, because Tom and I don't live very far apart, maybe just an hour and a half or so. But, Tom would spend the whole day in an area the size of my yard, and I'd probably be 6 miles back in the woods, but we need us all there. But Cliff was like, man, he's like, I just don't get out anymore. He's like, I'm at these conferences all the time. And I was listening to him talk, and I thought, I have to do this. I'm a chiropractor. I already make a living. And so when I got home, I was getting at that point where I was getting able to speak wherever I wanted to go. And I had a lot of them lined up in a lot of states. And I just called all of them. And I just said, I'm not doing it anymore. I'm going to do podcasts. But, like this weekend, they had the inaugural West Virginia Bigfoot Festival, and they asked me to speak. And I was like, hey guys, I'm sorry. I just don't do it. I was in the woods, so while everybody else is doing that thing, I want to resolve the Bigfoot thing. I'm just hungry for it still. And I feel this race, I'm in great shape and I work out all the time, but I'm 57. How many more years I'm going to be able to climb those hills like I do now? I need to get this worked out one way or another. And of course, podcasts are awesome because, you and I can talk, and it's Sunday night. I've already been out and did the woods thing. And, but if I was going to, I'm probably going to go Crypticon this year just because I haven't been there. Lexington's only 3 hours from me. And, but I'm just not going to very many anymore. I go to Ohio because it's a good chance for me to get to see a bunch of people, but, just where I'm at.
Yeah. And I'd love to go. I got invited out to do Beachfoot this year. Todd sent me an invitation to do Beachfoot, and I wanted to go, but it was super expensive just to get.
I know. How do you do that, man?
Yeah, I couldn't be any farther away. And then I'm like, I've got to take time away. I've got 3 shows that I do weekly. Like, how am I going to do enough shows to keep stuff going out? Because this is the way I make a living now. So I was like, I appreciate it, Todd. I'd love to go, and hopefully I'll be in a better position to make it next year. But it's going to cost me $2 or $3 grand just to go to the Smoky Mountain Bigfoot Conference to get a spot.
Actually, yeah.
Take stuff to sell, and hopefully, I'll break even or maybe pay for my Airbnb spot while I'm there. But people don't realize the money it takes to do stuff like that. They're like, well, why don't you come out to the conference? Well, because I can't,
Yeah.
I mean, I could do it, but I'm going to lose money doing it. And when this has become your job, it's kind of difficult to do, you know?
Yeah, Cliff and Jeff, that's how they're making part of their income. They're speaking. I think I had breakfast with Jeff at Ohio a month or so ago. And I want to say, he's speaking around 40 times a year. So it might be the biggest portion of his income or whatever. But, I picture myself more the John Mayensinski, the wildlife biologist that, he's only been on like, I think that the Sasquatch Chronicle guys might have had, or not West, but the guys from Carolina, the Sasquatch track guys.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think they had him. He's awesome, but man, he never speaks anywhere. He hardly does any podcasts. He's just in his woods doing his own thing. And I think that some of us are going to be like that. We're going to be not the guys that choose to go anymore to speak at the conferences. I mean, I enjoyed it, but I just, when I did the second book, when it got released, they signed a contract for me to go redo the first book, a second edition. And he's like, I'd like to have it, like in the 6 months. And I was like, man, I don't have anything else to say. I've said all I have to say. Let me go in the woods. Let me interview some people and I'll have something to say. And it was about 2 weeks ago, I started now on that second through it. And, but hopefully they stand the test of time.
Yeah, I think so, man. I'm going to see Meldrum up at, he's actually like the keynote speaker in the Smoky Mountain Conference coming up next month. So, you see the same people over and over and over again at these conferences, and I guess it never gets old.